Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Francisca Tirtodi Surya. Today we will talk about the needs for international relations and diplomacy skills. Firstly, I want to introduce myself. I am a United Nations representative for UN ECOSOC New York headquarters in Business, Innovation, Research and Development NGO Paris. I'm also a CITES Fellow for UNSDSN or the United Nations Sustainable Development Solution Network and also a co-founder of Kita Peduli Indonesia Foundations that based in my country of origin, that is Indonesia. This organization is a humanitarian-based organization to help survivors of natural disaster in Indonesia. We also initiate actions for COVID-19, that is to provide personal protective equipment or PPE for medical doctors in places that is unreachable by the government. Along the 2018 and 2019, we already helped thousands of natural disaster survivors from Lombok, Bali, Palu earthquake, Palu Donggala tsunami, Mount eruptions in Bali, and so on. And I'm currently living here in Sydney, Australia. Firstly, I want to introduce you guys to the United Nations in a whole. United Nations is aimed to create a world filled with peace, security, and development. It is linked to the UN Charter that was initiated in San Francisco in 1945 that are global peace, global security, global development. United Nations is present physically in the 195 countries through the UN organizations, agencies, and the resident offices. United Nations function is not to intervene national affairs except when they have very serious matters with peace, security, and human rights. This is the only case when the UN can influence government decisions. The United Nations body that I'm worked in, that is the United Nations Economic and Social Council or UN ECOSOC, and we will talk a little bit about this. To begin with, the United Nations system is based on 5 principal organs. The first is the General Assembly, then the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council or ECOSOC that I'm worked in, then the International Court of Justice and the UN Secretariat. The United Nations Economic and Social Council or ECOSOC itself is the diplomatic UN member, which is highly dedicated to help and support other UN bodies for both economic and social supports. It is the master of organizations on a resolutions of UN General Assembly to transform the Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs in Agenda for Action 2030 into reality. Here we can see a large proportion of job materializations of the SDGs is under the responsibility of UN, ECOSOC as much as 80%. And yes, another 20% is under the responsibility of other UN agencies, such as FAO, UNESCO, and so on. Then I want to introduce you in particular to Business Innovation Research and Development or BIRD. This is the NGO in consultative status with ECOSOC that I'm worked in right now. Consultative status to ECOSOC is the highest status granted to NGOs by the United Nations, which allows them to participate in the work of the UN. Therefore, the NGOs with consultative status to ECOSOC is also mentioned in the UN Charter. The growing number of NGOs with consultative status is also one of the benchmark of diplomacy growth in the world. For a deeper explanation, the consultative status is obtained after the NGO has been audited by a UN group of representatives of member states that are 19 states. Then other 54 technical experts from ECOSOC can confirm the decision made by the auditing of NGO committee. There are 3 statuses, that is special, general, and roster, and BIRD has a special status. According to the CEO, namely George Reggio, BIRD NGO was established with the philosophy of bird as a flying animal. It was derived from the CEO meeting with a wounded bird. Then he realized of how fragile our world is. The philosophy is that this NGO will be like a bird, a high flyers that look after poor people to deal with poverty eradications, economy rehabilitations, reconstructions, and recovery. Though diplomats will surely have more say about their professions, we will talk about this profession in a nutshell in our discussion. but I would like to first start from how it is to becoming a United Nations representative and also needs to carry these diplomacy skills. First, from the right and obligations of this role. As a United Nations representative, I work on behalf of the United Nations to maintain peace, security, and the development of the world. To work on behalf of the United Nations, I'm expected to use the perspective of the United Nations to be country and business neutral in the use of diplomacy. Country or state neutral means to not working for a particular state, such as Indonesia, France, Mexico, or Japan, but only for ECOSOCs, and also supporting all UN members and eventually all of UN agencies. This also means I need to avoid working for any levels of governments, such as local, national, and international. My agenda of programs should also implement Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, at the ground level. The benefit of becoming a United Nations representative is being able to enter all premises at the UN worldwide without further questions or clearance or complements of checks and balance to participate in all UN meetings in the world, not only in the United Nations or the New York headquarters that I'm registered in, or in Paris, where is my NGO located, but is all around the world. Before we start into our main topic about international relations and diplomacy, we have to agree upon this. From now on, we will call the country as a state, not a country in words. Why? As stated here, state, which I mean, is US, France, Japan. It's not California, New York, and Texas. Why do international relations call them state? Because state has sovereignty and legitimacy. Sovereignty, according to Britannica Encyclopedia, is an authority of ultimate overseer in the decision-making process of state and in the maintenance of order. In a simple version, it's an authority of the state to do whatever they wish to their state. While legitimacy is an acceptance of authority from other states and their own people that is needed to acknowledge as a state. This is why these two main ingredients of state is really important. Please save these two inside our mind because we will come back again to these two in the whole of our discussion tonight. In the international relations, we do not call them a nation, country, or nation state, because nation is a group of people who share identity and culture, such as Indian, Chinese, Australian, while country is a territory, and a nation state is a group of people who share the same national identity and aim to build a state. However, they cannot earn legitimacy and sovereignty. Therefore, they cannot earn state as a legal name. Then we can talk about what is international relation. It is an entire global community interacting together and working together. International relation concern about the relationships among the world's governments. It's not only the interactions between 2 or 3 governments, but multiple states working together. International relation is affecting citizen itself, for example, like war and other activities. The question is, how can multiple state actors has a collective interest? The answer is because they have to forego their own interests. For example, like global warming. If states want to contribute to pursuing the same goals, they have to limit their energy consumptions for a greater good. Because each states focus on their own interests, international relations become the medium to manage this interest between states to match each other. Actors in the international states are also comprised of non-state actors that are intergovernmental organizations, that is like the UN. It's collective states that working together, such as OPEC, or economic organizations, NATO military organizations, the UN itself, and large organizations that cover states, or G8, it's like small organizations between states. Then we also have non-governmental organizations that I explained earlier. But there are some that's really big, like Amnesty International, Red Cross, and so on. Another state actors is multinational corporations. It's a large-scale corporations that has its branches in many states. For instance, Toyota, McDonald's, Walmart, BP, Shell, and etc. Then individuals that consisted of world leaders of individual that's really wealthy. They're also considered as non-state actors. Also the citizen itself, of course. Then we will talk about realism and idealism. Realism is the central position in the study of international relations. The oldest perceptions of international relations is based on realism. The foundations of realism is the principle of dominance that state interacts around the idea of power. It's like, who has power and how to be more powerful? While idealism emphasizes international law, morality, and international organizations rather the power alone as a key influence on international events. Therefore, idealism pictures human nature is essentially good instead of evil. Therefore, states need to cooperate to work together in addressing issues. This theory pictures the international system as a whole peaceful community, but realism underlining the competition between states. In order to prosper, dominating is to one another is a must. But this is not wholly right. It is true that every state needs to work together to achieve mutual goals like sustainable development goals. However, disruptions are also always there. We have to build anticipations to maintain international peace and security. This is where we can see that realism and idealism has to work hand in hand. But why the world needs international relation? Firstly, because of the anarchic or self-help structures of international system. Each state needs to depend on self for survival and for their own future. Second, lack of trust between states. Because each state has sovereignty and legitimacy, they are unable to control each other. States become fear of other states. Then these fears breeds lack of trust. That's the issue. The third is because of misconception and miscommunications. Again, the sovereignty and national pride usually lead them to view another country as threatening or misperceptions of motive states. This leads to picturing other states as an enemy, while it's actually only based on miscommunication. We are actually living in the most peaceful season in history. There is no hegemonic wars, and such wars like World War I, II, or Cold War, like we experienced in the past. To take an example, Germany and France, that was declared war against each other in World War I, has now become an associates in European Union. States has come to realize that maintaining global peace and security has to lead the world into better expected outcomes of economic growth and the prosper of humanity, which seems better than to pursue dominions and eradicate their own people. Recently, states has come into synergy to address mutual issues such as human rights, development, and environmental degradations. This is when Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals come into the surface. As we can see here, there is the Kantian triangle. That's explaining why the international community is shifting toward the trend of peace. The first is the establishment of the world federations or international organizations, such as United Nations, where states can come together to discuss issues and conflict. Second is the economic dependency between states. There is a huge increase in trade within states globally. The trade is not only about goods, but also about information. The third is because we have plenty of republic states and democracy recently. where their people have their say about the government. Therefore, moving toward war would be very difficult now, because state leader no longer can act as a dictator or monarch or an absolute authority. These three then lead us into the peace at the central. Then we will talk about international institutions. As the international community agreed upon moving toward peace, rules must be set up of what states need to do, how they need to react, and how the government interact between one another. Therefore, states can be developed around these rules. Therefore, they need international institutions that will maintain the rules. These international institutions will become a place where they can discuss what is best for every state. This is how the international community maintained the world to be less conflict today. And yes, one of the international institutions once again is the UN. In the Millennium Declaration in September 2000, world leaders stressed that making globalization a positive force for all is the central challenge before the international community. People must feel included if globalization is about to succeed. Moreover, mayors of major cities conduct international meetings because their responsibilities and political exposure are now international. For instance, Mayor Bloomberg of New York is using his office and personal wealth to promote global and national causes through an office for international affairs. Then we know a group of over 60 world cities called C40 has formed a diplomatic alliance to discuss issues related to climate change. These cities offer lessons for states. This is when globalization is start to be happening in the states. Then we move to global citizenships. Global citizenships by definition is the people of the world are one people. They are enriched by individual differences, united by common bond of humanity. Or simply, that's the individual who has global awareness about what's happening in the world. Why becoming a global citizen is important? To quote the President Kennedy words, "Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved only by man. The state is not them and us." This is what we can see that states needs all of us, the citizen, to help them solve the problems. There is a survey conducted by Ipsos Global Advisor which mentions that people who are travel and living overseas has more global awareness and embrace their citizenship as a global citizen. About 88% of Indian, 86% of Mexican, and 84% of Korean and so on believe that their country should help the government of the democracy and development of the world. Global citizenships also happen as world leader mentions that they are urging for a better dialogue with their citizens. This idea is also welcomed by scholars. According to a survey 20 years ago, about 80% of US college graduates say that they want to change the world, and 40% say that they would change the world. The International Red Cross is a living testament to a 19th Global Citizenship Initiative. Many organizations today abound to titles like Global Citizens Initiative, Global Citizens Networks, and so on. And now we will talk about human rights. Human rights has long recognized as a focal point of international relations. Human rights can be defined as a rights to which all human beings per se are entitled and can lay claims upon in society. States are facilitating many declarations about human rights for a long time before the World War was conducted. Declarations of human rights in history are Magna Carta in 1215 in England, Bill of Rights in 1688 in England as well, Declarations of Independence in 1776 in the US, Rights of Man and the Citizens in 1787 in France, and the Declarations of Rights of the Working and the Exploited People in 1918 in Russia. In today's world, we usually refer to UN Declarations of Human Rights, first up to fourth of Geneva Conventions, Vienna Human Rights, and many more. UN Charter itself also talk about human rights. To sum up, UN Charter wrote about to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Through these declarations and conventions, states are moving toward rights and freedom of their own people. They set the pace against all kinds of exploitations and oppressions of individuals. The significant pace was made at the end of World War II, or in 1940s. Some of its precursors was included the laws of armed conflict, the champions of the abolitions of slave trade and slavery, the champion for women's suffrage, the work within the League of Nations for the protections of minority rights, and the International Labour Organization's effort on worker rights. Human rights itself has changed the whole scenario from conducting war to earn dominations into human being focused. Then we will talk about human rights and sovereignty. The Chinese representative in Vienna Conference in 1993 has raised the plural implementations of human rights of every state. This is to write what was said. Countries at different stages of development or with different historical traditions and cultural backgrounds also have different understanding and practices of human rights. Thus, one should not and cannot think that the human rights standards and models of certain countries are the only proper ones and demand that all countries comply with them. This is raised another issue to the forefront, the issue of domestic jurisdictions and national sovereignty. The implementation of human rights is now dependent on every state's law and sovereignty. As mentioned earlier, the United Nations does not want to trespass state sovereignty, except if there is a massive crime against humanity. This is for the first time the international law entered the realm of states' domestic jurisdiction. That is where there is a use of violence by states in its boundaries. We should have a clear border to distinguish between legitimate acts of warfare and criminal violence and brutality. In a world of democracy, human rights and development require political and economic pressures on the states. NGOs and others involved in these actions directly as well as indirectly. The human rights has evolved a lot from the first, second, and third generation. These instruments include civil, political, economic, social, cultural, and as well as the rights of development. In addition, the rights of clean environment. And now, as human rights has become the focal point of international relations, democracy and development has been integrated to it and raised the concerns of states. And now, the actors of human rights. For a decade, Amnesty International insists that only governments were accountable for human rights violations in their territory. However, in 1991, after the end of the Cold War, the Amnesty International adopting its new policy to targeting the non-state actors. To shift the target from state, human rights groups not only sought to affect the power to end violations, but also to aim for conflict resolution. Nowadays, the key actors in human rights advocacy are the NGOs and their broader advocacy network. Why all of us needs to contribute to the implementation of human rights? Because this issue is complicated, and the only possibility to solve it is through the interdisciplinary approach by all of us joining hands together. Then let's move to diplomacy. Martin White characterized diplomacy as the monster institutions of international relations. Back to the UN Charter, UN documented that the will of this founding member in favor to peaceful settlements of disputes by agreeing to adopt peaceful methods to solve bilateral and multilateral disputes. The founding member of the UN restores the long-established need and value of diplomacy. Though this is not the first time when the diplomacy born, however, this is the first significant piece of international community to embrace diplomacy as a significant element of international relations. Let's come to the definition of diplomacy. Diplomacy itself is defined by the Berich in 2005 as an essential political activity that is well-researched and skillful, and a major ingredient of power with a purpose, to achieve states' foreign policy's objective without force, propaganda, or law. This view appears straightforward. However, it has debated by many scholars as an imprecise way to define diplomacy. First, because it neglects the conceptualizations of diplomacy itself, that is, the peaceful characters of diplomacy, the identity of diplomats, and the diplomacy's connections to the state system. Some other scholars like Johnson and George view diplomacy as the opposite use of force or threat, which is not matched to these definitions of diplomacy. Besides, diplomacy is also not limited to professional diplomats only, or namely narrow diplomacy, as mentioned by Nicholson. But it is including all actors in a state, including its citizens, which refer to public democracy that we will discuss later. The diplomacy not only limited by state system and political entities, diplomatic in modern era has gone beyond these borders. Diplomacy is currently viewed as mediations between estranged individuals, groups, and entities that is necessary because human alienations, as mentioned by Derrien. It means diplomacy is no longer limited to interstate activity. It can be used by all of us as an everyday activity basis. Diplomacy in 1945 is comprised of some key ingredients. The first is a major global issue to deal with, that is aftermath of World War II. Another ingredient is a large and more sufficient powers to lead the effort, which is also affected by the world's two powerful blocs in that moment, that is United Nations and Soviet Union. Another ingredient is powerful new resources to tap as stability and as the world trade was just re-established in that moment. And also a new leadership movement as international community has a new directions of peace than domination. Another ingredient is the new of mass media in that place, that is like radio and TV in that moment. And also the hope and innovations of international government body like United Nations, and a fuss of new industries and automobile and so on, like DNA and so on. After World War II, the international community has changed drastically. The number of states has tripled. It's 3 times than it was. In 1946, it was only 45 NGOs that has consultative status with UNSA. But now there are 4,045, according to the United Nations. And the diplomacy that was only involving state actors are now becoming broader to non-state actors as well. So there are many types of diplomacy. There are political, military, economical, cultural, oil, water, preventive crisis courses, diplomacy, and so on. You can learn more in another occasions. However, to understand the scenario of diplomacy in today's world, let me introduce you to these two types of diplomacy. They are public diplomacy and traditional diplomacy. Traditional diplomacy is an international actor's attempt to manage the international arrangement through the engagement of another international actor. This type of diplomacy is usually done by professional actors and resident embassies. On the other hand, public diplomacy is an international actor's attempt to manage the international arrangements through the engagement with a foreign public. So let's talk about traditional diplomacy in a whole. Firstly, we want to learn directly from diplomat professions to get the whole meaning of traditional diplomacy. Diplomat in brief is an ambassador of messengers of peace. According to Alexander Karagianis, a United States diplomat, the job of diplomat is to gather information, make sense of it, reporting it, influence people, and do advocacy. In short, what diplomat do if we want to observe diplomacy as a verb, is to listen, learn, think, adapt, lead, act, produce an outcomes that matters to serve our state. Diplomats see a no answer as an interim, because with diplomacy we expect to change this type of answer. One of the skills of diplomacy is negotiations, as viewed by Roger Fisher and William Ury as a classic negotiations to getting answer yes to every occasions of diplomacy. Being a diplomat is also beyond our common perception. First, officers who serve overseas did not serve at home. And second, the political and consular specialties. Therefore, diplomat is not only staying at office and replying emails from another state's diplomat and so on, but they also work in the field for the safety and livability of refugees, for example, natural disaster survivors and so on. That we also do the diplomacy stuff as I conducted in the Kita Peduli Indonesia Foundations, that to show us the diplomacy activity can actually be carried by everyone, including all of us. Because diplomacy mentioned as picturing as a no as an answer of interim, diplomacy usually seen as a dark and deceit one. It is like diplomat can lying abroad for one's country. Will this kind of diplomacy work? Yes, but only if the diplomacy is only a one-off game. However, we know that the real diplomacy is not only a one-off game, but is iterative business on continuous relationship. This condition requires trust from every side of diplomacy actors, and it only can be gained through the telling the truth. Therefore, lying should be avoided in diplomacy. On the other hand, common perception usually see diplomacy as an instrument of foreign policy and statecraft. This view is not wrong, but imprecise. If we picture diplomacy as an instrument of both statecraft and foreign policy, diplomacy itself will lose its meaning because it can be used for deceit and dark purpose, as mentioned earlier. Diplomacy should be seen as one of the instruments of foreign policy, but also as a practice or constitutes, reproduce, maintains, and transform international system and world orders into more peaceful, secure, and development focused. Then we will learn about good and bad diplomacy. Raymond Aron represents diplomacy as an element of state power that implies the use of economic and physico-political. In this view, a successful diplomacy can reflect the state's power, when a failed diplomacy will restrict it. Skillful diplomacy can even increase the power of a nation. But on the other hand, Raymond Aron himself mentions that the type of pure diplomacy that actually as simple as the art of persuasions. That's really simple, isn't it? Without any kinds of economic and political pressures. However, he doubted that this kind of diplomacy still exists in today's world. So, what is public diplomacy? Public diplomacy is the diplomatic system which actors are the non-state actors such as NGOs, cities, business, individuals, and philanthropists. In this type of diplomacy, a diplomat will still be deployed as a facilitator, a conceptualizer, and a symbol of cooperation who has the capacity and the mindsets to link complex issues. The main reasons of the emergence of public policy is the weak domestic government that also means fragile institutions. The weak states and the new divisions has also opened the possibilities for other actors to appeal to the citizens for allegiance and to promote an agenda that is different from the sovereign states that we usually know. This weak government and institutions also noticed by states themselves. States recognize that they have neither the time nor resources to stick into the diplomatic behavior that we used to know. We know that their economies are highly interdependent to non-state actors as well as their jobs and investment flows across borders. And information flashes around the world before the traditional diplomacy either knows or intervened. Public, in the widest sense of term, are now a diplomatic actor that states ignores at their peril. Now the perspective of the citizens as the information is now greatly accessible. They are no more educated about the state that they are in, with their exactments to contribute. The state is no longer able to replying the pure propaganda, because the public is now demands to be involved in the state diplomacy and they're already literate. And we will talk about the impact of ICT in the diplomacy and transformations. The Information and Communications Technology, or ICT, has extraordinarily developed through recent decades. Moreover, after the pandemic issue that everyone is enforced to learn the new medium of ICT. Before the pandemic, the International Communications Union estimated that there were 545 million cell phone subscriptions in Africa in 2012, representing 63% of the populations. This compared to only 12 million landlines that were in operations. In the first decade of the 21st century, Internet users in the world rose from 350 million to 2 billion. ICT has made the world smaller and also given small states and non-actors vast opportunity to influence international events. The pace of the change in communications and information gathering, even the use of social media like Twitter and YouTube, is not only changing the way diplomat works and behave in the international community, but also opening up new possibilities in diplomatic behavior for non-state players. Social media are the newest arrival of the technology scenes and for obvious reasons break down geographical and social barriers. This leading diplomats to rethink about their diplomacy approach, and now there is no more possible secret to be hidden from other states' diplomats. The netizens, as we usually call the internet users, has gone from using social media as a lifestyle only into a way of interconnecting and energizing debate and actions about state-based issues. A platform like YouTube has shifted power to non-state disruptors. The internet has opened ways of influencing opinion that no political or religious movement could have dreamed of in the past era. The Twitter hashtag, on the other hand, has also able to distort information deliberately from the facts. So this ICT improvement can lead to negative outcomes. This also means that our terms as an individual can now contribute to international diplomacy as a modern version of a diplomat. This is why learn diplomacy to target peace is crucial. Moreover, our rights to freedom of expression is prized in the UN Declarations of Human Rights. To the global seamless communications that is now open to any actors of all genres, states are now facing both threats and opportunity. All of the information that kept from citizens is now accessible through the help of the search engine. This is a real threat since the state cannot predict the threat that is coming to them. However, there is an opportunity of interconnections between the state and its citizens that helps diplomacy in the whole as well. The globalization has resulted in the lost identity, but public democracy bring it back. We will talk about this. State domestic and overseas policies and decision-making processes has increasingly blurred as the impacts of globalizations. The impact of a country makes to attract foreign investors, tourists, and those searching for educations. However, much of public diplomacy agenda is directed toward differentiating of the states from others, which is the other benefit of public diplomacy. In today's world, everyone can be a diplomat. Publics themselves can now fulfill some of the traditional functions of diplomacy. They report on social media about what is happening in their country to their foreign country. They can assist to protecting another citizen, for example, by using cell phones to alert authorities to identify dangerous locations in a real time. And they can also damage a state's reputations. It's like a negative side of it, just as much as any official actions. Now, diplomacy become richer as the benefit of unpredictable public diplomacy because there is no particular rule that one fits all. In most cases, the young will be seen as a part of public diplomacy target. Because one day they will be travel, one day perhaps they will seek educations overseas, they will run businesses, and they will have the futures of the world because they will be the future's leaders. However, the multiplicity of actors with a modern capacity to influence diplomacy exacerbates the risk of unexpected challenge from unanticipated events. Therefore, guidance and also law and order are strongly needed to maintain this. Now we will learn about diplomatic language. Without communication, there is no diplomacy. Because in fact, diplomacy is often defined as a regulated term of communications. Let us see into this sample. Thomas Friedman wrote in the New York Times that a state peace-based cooperation is rejected due to the impolite language used in the letter that sends to him. Here we can see the importance of diplomatic language. Diplomatic language is an arbitrary set of signals, codes, and conventions that lubricates rounds of sharp edge and creates space for possibility, or instrument of international society that designs to minimize misunderstandings and miscalculations that give rise to conflict. Diplomat as a political actors is really embedded into social context, which privileges to be careful, controlled, and cautious behavior. Therefore, a diplomatic language is really critical. The functions of diplomatic language is same throughout time. Is to lubricate the great and smaller gears, to separate political communities into a single international system. In short, is to become the bridge of each others. We will talk about verbal and non-verbal language. Diplomatic communications includes not only words as well as actions, but also silence and inactivity. In fact, diplomatic actors knows well that whatever they say or not saying, or whatever they do or not doing, will always be interpreted by others in the diplomatic situation. We commonly associate diplomacy with linguistic skill. While diplomatic communications among Greek city-states was dependent on direct and oral exchange and face-to-face contact between representatives. As diplomacy is type of communications, the aim of communication is to minimize misunderstanding. Therefore, both verbal and non-verbal communication is really important. As an obvious example of verbal communication in diplomacy is, besides the body language, is also the handshakes that able to send signals of friendly interstate relations. Because a refusal of handshakes is sending signals to them that the relationship between states is rejected. Other type of verbal communications is interstate diplomatic ambience in the format of venue that is chosen for international meeting. For example, the format and venue for particular meeting, they wants to change it to become something else, and it's actually send signals of diplomacy to another state. And also the choice of delegate that's sent by particular country to another. It's also another type of diplomacy is non-verbal. And also the travel schedules of state leader. For example, the state leaders don't want to travel to the capital city. They want to travel to the non-capital city. That also sends another signals to the particular state that they're about to come into. Also governing custom decisions in exploiting army and so on. A good diplomatic language is like a suspension bridge. It's precisely anchored in the bedrock of each side. Whether the tongue is used or not, the manner of speech is designed to bridge disagreement and maintain connections of diplomatic representations of it. Words are needs to be chosen to be precise enough to communicate clearly to diplomatic activity, yet elastic enough to be plausibly suggest the alternative meanings the diplomatic's political masters needs. They also need to manage their domestic politics. A good diplomatic language is also able to adapting into the local conditions into the international environment. As young diplomats, they usually intend their time to effort to understand, inform, and influence global public opinion through the short, fast bursts and digital speech. But we should to remember that the purpose of diplomacy is to engage in a vigorous argument about political disagreements by sustaining the relationship needed to order in the international system. Therefore, it's not only about our opinion and how we deliver it, but also about what kind of outcomes that we are about to reach. We can be young, brave, and fearless, yet we have to bear in mind that diplomacy is about to bridge, not the opposite. A good and well-maintained language will result in the best outcomes in diplomacy. In conclusion, learning international relations and becoming a global citizen is critical for our generations. We, as young generation, is fortunate to live in the era of ICT, where we can access state-based and international informations and social media only from our thumbs. It is important that we use this opportunity to learn and develop ourselves and to equip ourselves to become the next leaders in our local, nationals, and even international community. We have to come to realize that being young people means being the holders of world's future ahead. And how we treat ourselves with educations or choose not to, our both will affect our futures and the world's futures as a whole. We can be leaders that only seek for powers and cause international chaos, or being a leader to bring peace, security, and development to the forefront is definitely our choice. Let us stop thinking our youth as something that is a playful time, a time to enjoy our lives only, but also a time to work hard. People usually say you only live once, so it is time for us to waste resources and do whatever that we want. But for myself in particular, as young people, I want to contribute to the world to make the world into a better place. We can contribute to the smallest idea, like implementing sustainable development goals, which I believe other speakers will talk more about it. But again, the choice is ours. As also we learned today that diplomacy is not only belongs to the professional diplomats or a United Nations representative, but to all of us, no matter that we are doing, because implementing sustainable development goals and maintaining world peace and security requires a lot of works that can only be done if we holding hands together and work interdisciplinary. Here in these occasions, I invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to work together with the United Nations and with the international community to become a diplomat of peace and security in whatever that you do. To always work to implement the SDGs as an SDG advocate in every field that you are in and that you will be working on in the future, and to become an example of other young people outside in the world, that we as a youth refuse to waste our time and resources for unnecessary activities. Instead, we committed to learn and to work hard as much as we can to become the next leaders that created the world into a better place. Thank you.